Hi. David Roden suggests that as life becomes ever more complicated and a grand narrative ever more improbable, the only political decision open to us is masochism, to enjoy the suffering which existence throws at us. Roden thinks that the world will become so alien to us that our current political projects are futile. So, are we stuck here? In this session, we'll think a bit about criticisms of postmodernism and whether there's a way to overcome the political impasse that it poses. Let's start with new materialisms and feminist science studies. Postmodernists have challenged science, colonialism, and other power structures for their totalizing narratives. But isn't this rejection itself totalizing? For example, when Derrida says there is nothing outside the text, John Haraway argues that if we really want to empower people, and especially women, we need to engage with the everyday material realities of how women are constituted. Haraway believes that the idea of a cyborg, a human who extends beyond their individual skin to appropriate and meld with their world, can help challenge what we consider to be natural to a woman or to any label that we apply to people. Karen Barad has critiqued postmodernist Judith Butler's idea that gender is something that is performative by arguing that such performances cannot be confined to language. They must involve a vast network of prior material relations. Jane Bennett points to the ways in which humans are intertwined with and constituted through their environment. While postmodernism has been a powerful force in raising awareness of liberal causes like sexism and totalitarianism, new materialists argue that its focus on the symbolic at the expense of the material holds it back from making real change or empowering women and vulnerable groups. Barad combines critical theory of people like Foucault and other postmodernists with rigorous engagement in sciences like quantum physics, while Elizabeth Grosz takes a similar approach to evolutionary biology. So they are bringing matter and science back into the kind of critical philosophy that postmodernists have been leading previously. Object-oriented ontology is a related idea, but with some key differences. New materialism generally focuses on networks and flows. Object-oriented ontology, as the name suggests, focuses on objects. It suggests that postmodernism has been too focused on humans and human societies at the expense of animals and everyday objects. Timothy Morton argues that to grasp issues like climate catastrophe, we need to appreciate objects as they really exist apart from human discourse or interactions. The problem is that the climate is made up of objects, or is an object, that is far bigger and more complex than any concepts or narratives we have about them. Although postmodernism is still dominant in many fields, especially in the humanities, it's never been the only game in town. Philosophy often gets divided into Continental and analytic schools, and it's the Continental tradition in which we generally put postmodernism. Participants in one tradition have tended to look down on or ignore participants in the other. So broadly speaking, analytic philosophy is interested in constructing systems, while Continental philosophy is interested in challenging them or pointing at what can't be captured in them. But some influential founding figures in analytic philosophy, like Carnap and Neurath, were in fact Marxists, and they were interested in creating a better society But for the most part, analytic philosophy developed in America as a response against the kinds of movements of thought that were seen in Europe and the Soviet Union at the start of the 20th century. Analytic philosophers have often assumed they can ignore thoughts from other times and traditions, instead focusing in on a narrow range of technical questions, often prioritizing accurate language use. A number of contemporary philosophers have come out of the analytic tradition to criticize this approach. Peter Unger, for instance, has argued that the focus on language and hypothetical scenarios has meant that the bulk of analytic philosophy has not made a single substantial claim, since their claims literally do not refer to substance, only to things like possible worlds or thought experiments. It doesn't look like either side has obviously won this battle. There have been a number of debates between analytic philosophers like Chomsky and Searle and Continental philosophers like Foucault and Derrida. Analytic philosophers have often pointed out the hypocrisy or paradox of claiming that we cannot know truth or that everything is relative, while holding this as something which is not itself in doubt. But if you watch these debates on YouTube, you'll notice how much both sides are talking past each other and aren't able to find productive common ground. For a large part of the 20th century, it seemed like there's an unbridgeable gap between analytic and continental philosophy. One thing we've seen throughout this course is that there is no philosophy, no thought that can offer a full picture of the world, and probably the best strategy is to try to work through these contradictions to see what different approaches can bring. And a new generation of philosophers is ignoring the continental analytic divide, or rather drawing what's best from both traditions. For example, Ray Brassier describes this as a dialectic between suspicion and trust. So the suspicion of postmodernism and continental philosophy, and the systematizing of analytic philosophy. Continental philosophy and various critical political theory has played a powerful role in challenging power structures, as we've stressed already, and they have made a dent in how we think about sexism, racism, and other forms of prejudice throughout history. But analytic philosophy has also been powerful in building systems that help us to understand our world and consciousness and practices. What is necessary is a continuous process of critique and construction. That's what Brassier is arguing. So if we're always critical and always constructive, then we can take what's best from both approaches. Brassier shares Mark Fisher's worry that Marxists and anarchists have in some ways sabotaged their own ability to articulate how a better world could be possible by aligning themselves with movements that oppose science and modernization, thereby reinforcing the assumption that an end to capitalism would mean an end to progress and enjoyment. Marxists like Wendy Brown, for example, express their anxiety about technology and growing social tensions, and express this in a desire to go back to a more primitive time without the stresses of modern life. Brassier's response is that if we form an autonomous commune, for example, while private companies like Amazon still exist, whatever we do will just be reabsorbed into capitalism. He suggests that analytic philosophy and Enlightenment thinkers like Kant and Hegel and Marx can help us to break out of the chains of capitalism, and specifically the chains it's placed on our imagination, and to rationally engineer an alternative future. This is a Marxism which appreciates science for emancipatory ends while appreciating what is special about humans and their communities. As we've talked about, many critics of capitalism and postmodernism have criticized its focus on individuals. So what should we do instead? It sounds a bit vague to say that we should focus on networks or groups. Perhaps a slightly more productive way to go forward would be to focus on practices. Let's think about what a practice is and what makes a good social practice. The ideas of Alistair McIntyre might be a helpful springboard here. You might want to pause the video now and read McIntyre's dense definition of a social practice. McIntyre uses the example of chess to explain what he means by an internal good versus an external good. A child might play chess because his granddad has bribed him with a chocolate bar. This would be an external good. As the child becomes better at chess, moves within the game, like particular openings, will themselves become motivating. Things that are a part of the practice motivate the practice for the participants of that practice. Not all labour is a good practice in McIntyre's sense. In fact, most of what we do in our day job isn't. We are motivated by the external goods of pay or the threat of being fired. For a practice to reduce rather than increasing our alienation, or for a practice to increase our freedom, what is good in the practice needs to be mutually recognizable and changeable by us and anyone engaging in the practice with us. It used to be possible to recognize a good chair quite easily. Someone who was a good chair maker could recognize good chairs, and other good chair makers could also be recognized by them. What made a good chair could change with every chair made. Furniture stores like IKEA destroyed this creative capacity, made all the furniture stereotypical, and flattened out these kinds of empowering relations to people's production and the objects of practices. What counts as excellence in McIntyre's definition depends on the judgments of a community. But this doesn't mean that it's all about language or that it's just relative. Over time, different cultures have independently settled on what counts as a good chair based on the material reality that they live in, the affordances in their environment, their needs as embodied human beings. The Marxist conclusion, partly rejected by McIntyre, is that human nature is also reconfigured through human practices. So ultimately this is really empowering because we can change who we are through participating in good social practices. McIntyre responds to Thomas Kuhn's influential book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn has been used to undermine the idea of scientific progress by pointing to the ways in which scientific consensus changes. The consensus, or paradigm, shifts. These shifts often happen suddenly, unpredictably, and dramatically, rather than in a straight line. But McIntyre argues that the ingredients for a revolution, or a paradigm shift, exist before it happens. So it's possible to see progress from one paradigm to the next by tracing back some of these causes, because a later paradigm can explain an earlier one, but not vice versa. McIntyre defends the position that it's possible for a group of people or a culture to make progress. He argues that a culture that has developed paints of certain colours or has a certain number of words for snow can engage in practices in more ways and with more freedom. They can appropriate aspects of their world in new ways, and that they can show things that would be insightful to a culture which only has a few colours or words for snow. Rather than seeing different cultures as so different, they are severed from each other in ways that make it impossible for members of one culture to explain their lived experience to one another, as many postmodernists have argued. MacIntyre suggests that a painter living in the Amazon basin or in 5th century Japan could still be introduced into the practices of a painter like Picasso in ways that would let them appreciate what was good about what Picasso was doing. The artist in the Amazon basin could similarly be recognized for her skill and would have things Picasso would appreciate. Aristotle would not be impressed by quantum physics, but he would be impressed by how we can transport large rocks using cranes. So there are lots of these points of potential intersection that depend on the material realities of our practices as humans in the world. Postmodernists are right that such progress can always be reinterpreted, but this does not detract from what MacIntyre is showing about our habits and practices and their relation to our flourishing and freedom. And this path is itself in need of critique. There's certainly aspects of MacIntyre's philosophy I'd want to criticize, like his reliance on the idea of virtues, but he's another alternative to some of the postmodernist authors who we've explored in the last session.